Pencil Kings, 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 Pencil Kings,
You got to do it. You got to get out there and try different things.
Welcome back. This is another episode of the Pencil Kings podcast, and I'm pretty excited today. I get to interview another podcast interviewer. This is a new thing. So recently, because I had volunteered to help the Mila project, which if you haven't checked it out, go to milafilm.com, milafilm.com. I'm not sure if we're going to get in the Guinness Book of World Records, but I think it is the largest animated short that's ever been done with a virtual team. I feel like we could call up Guinness and this could be a thing. So milafilm.com. But today I'm talking to Carl Olson of the Digital Convervence Podcast, where he's also talking to artists all over the world. So this is going to be awesome. And we're here to ask Carl about his story and talk about some of the cool people that he's talked to, because he's been doing this far longer than I have. So it's a chance for me to learn from the expert as well. So welcome to the Carl. Snafu right off the bat. How are you doing today?
I am so good I can't stand myself. And it's a real privilege to be on your show. I was so happy that you reached out to me, because I don't mean anything bad by this, but I hadn't heard of your podcast. And then I got an email from you, and I said, wow, this is great. It's just a serendipitous find. So I really appreciate you taking the time to have me on the show. I'm not used to being on this side of the seat.
Oh, it's fun. To start off, why don't you give people a 1-minute overview more about you, and we'll talk more about your podcast in a minute, but more about you, who you are, and what you've been working on, and just as a good jumping off point.
Well, I call myself a digital media creative, but it really goes beyond just being digital. It also includes the analog. And, for many years, I was a software developer, and then that software development morphed into content creation, which allowed me to express myself creatively. And so every job, every client that I ever had always looked for a creative outlook, or an outlet, I should say. And that has led to what I do today, where I'm primarily a content producer and artist.
And what does that mean, a content producer? Just to clarify for people, because I feel like sometimes we throw out these industry terms, not that necessarily is one, but there's other levels to it. So what does a content producer mean to you?
Well, a content producer to me is someone who authors, who creates like training materials, film, anything that empowers, educates, and enchants an audience, empowers them. So it could be just simply a video or a podcast. And that's what I do. I create podcasts. I create training videos. I used to do a lot of client work, but I don't do client work much anymore. I primarily produce content that I sell or help other people sell content.
Perfect. All right. Well, now let's go in and just talk a little about the Digital Convergence Podcast, because what I feel like the cool thing about interviewing someone who has interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people is that I'm sure there are standout episodes that are still fresh in your mind, even if you have done them years ago, because I know for me, there's certain podcasts that I recommend to people over and over and over again. They're just that good and that relevant. So could you introduce the Digital Convergence Podcast? And for people listening, I listened to a few episodes a few weeks ago when I was sort of hunting around, and it's a great podcast you can add to your rotation. So if you're waiting, for another episode of our podcast to come out, there's tons of great stuff out there.
I like that. That's what I say. The Digital Convergence Podcast is something that I started back in January of 2010, I believe it was. And it was at the height of the DSLR video revolution. So this is back in the day when video equipment was very expensive. The entry price point to get into doing professional video and filmmaking was high. And then Canon came out with this camera that was a hybrid or a convergence camera. It combined stills and video in one body. And I don't even think Canon realized what they were doing. It was just kind of an afterthought. But what you ended up with was a DSLR camera, a digital camera that had this huge sensor on it, had some of the finest lenses in the world, and it produced this amazing image at a very affordable price point. And I bought one of these cameras back in 2009, I believe it was. It's Canon 5D Mark II. That camera there, that one Canon camera that I bought would go on to revolutionize the way I did business. And that's probably the single biggest return on investment, I guess you could say, by buying that piece of equipment. But anyway, I didn't know anything about it. And the way I learn a lot of times is just by talking to people. And so I had this audacious idea. I said, you know what? I'm going to start a podcast. I'd been listening to podcasts for years before they were even called podcast. I was a software developer. I listened to a guy, I think his name was Carl Franklin. He had this show called .NET Rocks. So it was about .NET programming. And so I used to listen to that. And I thought, well, that's a pretty cool idea because I could listen to it as I went to a client or while I was traveling. And I learned so much. And so that's the way I started learning a lot of different things. But the problem was no one had a podcast about this whole idea of shooting videos with DSLR cameras. So I said, well, okay, I'm going to create one then. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I just started. And it was, and here I am, I'm still doing it. And I admit it's been, little hiccups along the ways. I've learned a lot of lessons along the way, but I've also talked to a lot of incredible people along the way in the podcast. And I've learned a lot, and I've created a network of friends, professional friends, that has really transformed the way I do business today.
I think that's really cool. I remember I found an old Canon that I had, an old Rebel, and what a revolution it was for the digital SLRs, but it didn't have any video, and I was a little bit bummed because I remember that revolution point where reading things online where, like, oh, this film is using this technique, and it, all of a sudden the production crew could have way more cameras on set, and people could hold it in their hands. It wasn't as huge, and they could still get amazing pictures or amazing video from it.
Yeah. It would just blew me away. I was watching films by Vincent Laforet, who's the movie that he produced for Canon was called Reverie, and that's the one that really just got people excited. And that was with a camera that couldn't shoot 24 frames per second, had a lot of glitches in it, and yet it still produced this amazingly beautiful film that before would require hugely expensive gear. So we all got excited. And then I was watching, Philip Bloom was another filmmaker that really took off with the Canon 5D Mark II. And, the rest is history, really.
So one of the things that I really liked about the story that you just told was the idea of not knowing what you're doing and just doing it anyway. And I don't know what it is, but I feel like that's a common thread for a lot of people that I've talked to, that often, there's with the creative route, there's not necessarily this, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 path that you can follow. Sometimes you just have to figure this stuff out, or you're just like combining A and B that's never really been done before, or if it has been done, it hasn't been documented, so you don't have a recipe to follow. So can you walk us through a little bit of some of those early interviews that you remember, or ones that stick out?
Well, you could go and listen to some of these and you'd say, wow, those things were terrible, how he did this. But you know what? There were some standouts, even with the poor production quality on my part. That's part of the learning process, get in there and try it and see. But anyway, I digress. Some of the lessons that I learned along the way, I had, for example, I'm trying to think of there were so many. I remember, for example, there was at this time, the TV show House MD was on with Hugh Laurie playing and that, they really created quite a stir when Gail Tattersall, who was the director of photography on that show, decided to do one entire episode of House MD. I think it was like the 5th season or 6th season series finale. It's been so long ago now, I forget. But he chose to shoot the entire thing in the Canon 5D Mark II. And so I decided to reach out to Gail Tattersall. And amazingly, he agreed to talk about this
Wow.
camera. And of course, some of the things he was talking about is, warts and all, this camera allowed him to work in very closed spaces. And this is a high budget television series working with some top-notch stars. And here he is using this inexpensive Canon 5D Mark II camera with all these limitations. And then the other thing I learned was he was not afraid to use inexpensive gear, not just the camera, but the lighting. For example, he went and got a bunch of lights from Home Depot. So a lot of the scenes that are lit in that particular episode with the Canon 5D Mark II were lit with Home Depot work lights. So you don't have to have this huge budget to create this cinematic look. So that taught me that you don't have to have the most expensive gear that's out there. It's real easy to get hung up on the gear, thinking you've got to spend thousands on lighting, you've got to spend tens of thousands on cameras and all of this. You don't. Most of that stuff exceeds our capabilities as artists anyway. So you don't have to spend so much money initially on equipment and gear. So that was a valuable lesson that I got from Gail Tattersall. Another thing he mentioned too, just a little side note that I thought that affected the art that we do. The problem with a camera that allows you to shoot beautiful images is that you want to make everything beautiful. So let's say the story is something that's ugly. He said one of the problems that people have is the directors of photography, they want to go and create that ugly scene with beautiful light and just make it cinematic. And he said, sometimes you don't want it to be beautiful. You need to portray it. You need to be careful to portray it the way it really is to support the story. So I thought that was a good balance to that, because we were all infatuated with bokeh and that large shallow depth of field resulting from that large sensor there. So he taught me a little bit about balance, that you don't have to have every image beautiful because it doesn't support the story. So that, those are artistic things that I learned and budgetary things that I learned just from that one guest. Then there was another breakthrough, I guess, that came several episodes later. It was episode, trying to remember, 17. There was this guy that I followed. I learned a lot about video from him. His name is Israel Hyman. Izzy Video was the name of his course site. So he had some video courses out there, and it was very inexpensive, and I subscribed to it. And I learned a lot about the craft just from being, doing just-in-time learning with his courses that he had out there. So I decided, I want him on the show. and he agreed to do the show. So he's talking to me in the show, and he asked me, well, Carl, what are you doing? So he kind of took over the podcast. And I said, well, I'm right now, one of my clients is a water damage restoration company. He says, Carl, what you need to do is tell them you'll shoot the video for free and then resell the training. I said, I don't know that they're going to go for that. But it did get me thinking. And I thought, well, okay, what do I have to lose? So I took his advice. I went to the person. He was actually a friend of mine, the guy I was shooting for. And I said, well, have you considered doing this? I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll start shooting your videos for free, and we'll sell the training if I get a cut of the training profits. And he thought about it. Took a while, took a couple of months or so, but he finally agreed. You know what? This is a great idea, so let's do it. And so that led to a business that was well over 6 figures each year. And that's just from that one guest on the show. So I always talk about, my podcast, I don't make a lot of money directly from the podcast, but my profit comes indirectly from the relationships and the things that I learn from the people that are on the podcast.
So just to clarify that, so you were making over 6 figures a year teaching people how to fix water restoration damage.
Yeah, isn't that sexy? That's just about as...
I don't know. I feel like, to me, anytime you can get paid for your craft and it not be like a really stressful thing, like I feel like the stress level on that project couldn't have been that high.
Well, it was pretty high because we were having to produce. The level of quality that we wanted was high because that was expected, but no one else was doing it, so we weren't clear. We didn't know for sure if people would buy it. And this is not just something that you pay, $20 a month for. Not that there's anything wrong with that kind of pricing. It has its place, but this is a business where people pay a large amount of money to leverage their ability to increase their profits. So we created a product that we were going to charge, $2,000 a year for them to access. But we had to test and see, well, will anybody buy this product, before we sink a lot of money and time into producing it. So one of the things that we did to see if there was interest was we sent out an email to his mailing list. He had several thousand people on the mailing list, and I think we had 200 or so. I can't remember the numbers now because it's been a long time ago, but I think it was around 200 people signed up to attend a webinar, which was just basically a series of slides that my business partner put together to explain what we are going to do. And at the end of that webinar, he said, if you'd like to be a part of this, here's what it's going to be, what it's going to cost. Well, we had 20 people sign up for $2,000 a piece.
Wow.
Sight unseen. Now, nothing shady was done. We explained up front there was nothing there. This is just, this is just basically a ticket to hold your place in the course. And we did the seminar and 20 people signed up. Well, think about that. That's $40,000 cash that you're going to get, right out of the gate. So, that was exciting, but it was also nerve-wracking because what that meant is we now had to go and produce and deliver to be legit. And so that was a lot of fun to do. So we immediately started creating episodes. At first, we were dripping out the episodes. I think we were doing 4 episodes a month. It's what we would release. And they would average between 5 to 15 minutes, depending on the depth of the topic. And it was really well received, and it just started to take off. And finally, we built up over the course of a year enough material where we just, instead of drip feeding the content, we would just let people have access to the entire library. And I did that for about 4 years, and then I finally sold out of that. But that was all because of my podcast. If I had never done the podcast, and if I'd never talked to it, I shouldn't say never because I don't know, but I just don't feel like, had I not talked to Izzy of Izzy Video, I probably would have never gone down this route. I would have probably continued to do the traditional gigs, trying to get the customers and getting paid for the work and then having to go and search for work again and that sort of thing. But he really got me excited about this idea of creating content, something that people could use, and then they could do it on a recurring basis. So our subscription started off at $2,195 for the first year, and then they would renew, I think it was $1,500 or $1,600 a year afterwards. And we had a very high retention rate on that. And then we were able to create other material that helped with certifications. And we sold a boatload of those. And all because I went to this guy at Izzy's urging, say, hey, I'll shoot video for free if you'll give me a cut.
That's just amazing. And I think just like for you talking with Izzy, I'm having the same kind of epiphany sitting here right now. I know there's a lot of people listening and they're like, how can I take my skills and turn it into some real money? And I feel like the story that you just told is a very clear illustration of just the very tip of the iceberg of all the opportunity that's sitting there waiting for creative people that need creative people. But we're sort of blinded by the sexiness of entertainment design and these things that you see a lot online when there's literally opportunity all around you, all over the place. And it's just waiting for you to get a little bit creative and not necessarily inject, but just step in there and say, like, I can do this for you. I can be part of this process and help you to turn this into something bigger.
Yeah, I mean, doing water damage training, on the surface I would have never dreamed in a million years I would even enjoy doing that. I mean, I have to admit, even doing the client work, I wasn't that excited about it. But you go through an attitude shift. It's really all about your own attitude, right? It's how you look at it. And I found that there were many ways to be creative and express my creativity in those episodes where it was appropriate to do so. And I actually enjoyed it. In the end, I enjoyed it. We were able to create a workflow where we would shoot, 4 to 8, maybe sometimes even 10 episodes in one full long production day. And I would have fun in post-production putting all that together, and worked out a very efficient workflow so that I could do it very quickly. So I wasn't working all the time. And it gave me the flexibility to work on other things as well that I found even more fulfilling.
Yeah, I think that's great advice that, there's the things that you do to be creative, and then there's also the things that you do to get paid. And sometimes they're not exactly the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. But you gotta do it. You gotta get out there and try different things. I was talking to, I think it was last year, I met the editor of the feature films series Hunger Games. His name is Alan Bell. And it was a great conversation. And then I also attended a lecture that he gave. And one of the things that he mentioned was how many people would come to him trying to get a job in the movie industry, whether it be VFX, editing, different post-production types jobs, digital media management services and that sort of thing. And he was always amazed at how many people they didn't even have the software. They didn't have anything to show. They were waiting for the big break. And of course, he said, I never hired those people. He said, the people I hired were the ones that had already bought, the software. And he says, yeah, sure, it's expensive software, but if that's what they want to do, they're going to make it happen. They're going to go out and get Creative Suite, Adobe's Creative Suite. They're going to go out and get Smoke from Autodesk or whatever. They're going to buy Cinema 4D or Nuke or whatever. If that's what they want to do, they're going to find a way to buy that and start using it and have something to show to people like him.
Yeah, I don't know what that is, like why there's that disconnect, because for you with your podcast, you just did it. You didn't know what you were doing, but and with the camera, you didn't know how to use it, but you thought, hey, I'm going to start talking to people and I'm going to start experimenting and see how they're using it, and then try things on my own and just keep moving forward. And I see the same thing with I want to work in games or film are the two big topics for us.
Yeah.
And I see people saying like, I want to work in games. It's like, okay, well, are you on a team yet? Well, what do you mean a team? It's like, well, there's all kinds of teams all over the world working for free that would love to have you as part of their team to help them out to make their game faster. And I'm not saying that you have to work for free, but when you're starting at the bottom, you just got to start working, doing something, and nobody's going to pay you when you have no skills, right?
Oh, exactly. And so you got to do it. You got to get out there and do it. There's no golden ticket to get you in. You've got to, I hate to use this phrase, but you do have to pay dues. Now, how you pay those dues, may not necessarily have to jive with what a lot of people assume is the way you go about doing it. Like another lesson that I learned, I'll give you an example of this. Another lesson I learned was from the director of photography for the show. Maybe your listeners might remember the show 24 with Kiefer Sutherland in it.
Yeah.
So Rodney Charters was the director of photography for that. And he did that series for 9 seasons. And then one day he was laid off, he and his team, because the show was canceled. And it's amazing when I go back and listen to that episode, I can hear the bitterness in his voice. He said, he was really uptight about the fact that here he'd put 9 years of his life into this show and he wouldn't get one dime of residuals from it because he was what they call below the line, the SAG line. It's I forget what SAG stands for, but anyway.
Screen Actors Guild,
yeah, that's it. Yeah. So he was below the line where they would get residuals. The actors get residuals, the director gets residuals, But a friend of mine, he was in the movie E.T. with Steven Spielberg. Just had a little tiny bit part, but to this day he gets a check.
Wow.
But the director of photography probably doesn't, because of the way the union rules are written on that. So that was another lesson to me about, you know what, I need to own the content. And that's the point that he made. But the other point that Rodney Charters made was, he said, sometimes he sees people going out and spending $50,000 on film school. He told me, he said, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but he said, I just want to tell those students to take that $50,000 and go out and create a film. Don't go to school, create the film. Because that $50,000 will get you the gear, it'll get you the people, it'll get you the raw materials that you need to produce the film. Going to film school, you're not going to get any of that. You're going to have to build on top of that, and then whatever it is that the teacher says. So go out there and spend the money on something that's going to help you learn and get the experience.
That's so great.
I hope that's not that's not to knock anyone that has gone to film school or art school or whatever. I'm not knocking education. But, a lot of times we forget that the reason schools are in business is it's a business, right? It's a business. I mean, even when I sell courses, guess what? It's a business. I want to sell you something. However, I'm not going to ask for $50,000 tuition. And you're not going to have to go get a student loan to buy my courses or to buy your courses or something like that. Just-in-time learning, it doesn't have to be expensive. But spending it on a prestigious school, I see all these people that are unemployed, not doing anything with their degrees. I'm thinking it's not a good thing anymore.
Yeah, and it's so expensive that, I've had people on the podcast and I've had co-workers, and they tell me about their their six-figure debt, which is, I can't even.
Oh, that's insane.
Begin to imagine to learn to draw, where I was asking around, and I think the school that I went to is still very affordable, $3,500. I didn't think the one that I went to was necessarily a great school, but my parents really wanted me to go.
Yeah.
But $100,000 is like, to put it in perspective, I would talk to like some MBAs, Masters of Business Administration, right, and they would have $100,000 in debt. However, they were getting like a pretty good jobs at that time. But yeah, these artists, it's not such a surefire thing. And it blew my mind.
Yeah. Well, everybody wants to be a creative because it's fun and it's rewarding. But as a result, you got a lot of competition and you got to really stand out. So you got to ask yourself, am I going to put the money in just the education or in the doing, practicing your art, actually doing your art? Because that's the only way you're going to make it really is to be good at what you do. Mm-hmm. And that's not to discourage people, but you do have to be good at what you do to really stand out and get the top dollar for the work that you do. I hope I didn't tick anybody off by saying that.
No, I think it's advice that needs to be heard. And I think I'm just thinking about the going and making a movie, all of the problems that you're going to have to solve
exactly
in that. And when somebody looks at that movie you made, whether it's good or whether it's bad, just the fact that you made it to the finish line and they're, still around to tell the story, they can, they could ask you questions like, hey, what was like the worst day of your production? Like, where did you think you were really going to just lose it and it wasn't going to come through? Because I'm willing to bet that like that's a story that they could really relate to. And when you tell that story, it shows that you're at the same, maybe not the same level, but you're playing in the same game. Whereas when you come from school, it's this controlled environment. A lot of things are already set up for you. But when you're guerrilla style, making it happen yourself, it's a whole different animal. And just the fact that you finished, it's something to be really proud of.
Yeah, I mean, that's your degree. That's what you hang on the wall, right? You got something to show for what you did. You don't have to take a test. I was reading which reminds me, see, I was in software. Today it's ludicrous what employers do to try to hire people. It's all the wrong things, I think, sometimes. And I've interviewed a lot of people, so my technique is very different. But a lot of times they do this thing called whiteboard testing. They'll write some obscure programming algorithm on the wall and expect the job candidate to totally ace that. And it's some obscure algorithm they'll never use. It's just crazy stuff. I don't understand that. I don't know. I don't want to work for somebody like that. And I don't want people who can whose only skill is passing tests to work for me. I want somebody that's a problem solver, has initiative, that will get up and go, can do. And that's the way my team was. I always had people who were good problem solvers, and many of them didn't have degrees. I never asked about the degree. I rarely ever talked about where did they go to school. I had one guy that did go to school. He was one of my best people in some respects, but he went to school for finance. But yet he was a developer. That's all he did. He was a software guy. So the degree that he had did not translate to the work that he had. However, he was a problem solver. He showed initiative in what he did. But some of my best people were those that didn't have degrees. They just, I don't know, I guess when they don't have degrees, they're hungry. They're willing to prove themselves. And I'm not saying don't get a degree. I'm not making a rule here, okay? Don't go against your parents' advice. But, there are other ways to learn, to get out there and get the experience that you need, whether you want to be an artist, you want to be a camera operator, you want to be a movie director, a software developer. It doesn't matter. Really, the principles are the same. What are you willing to learn? One of the questions I did use in interviews, by the way, was highly telling of the kind of person I would be hiring. I would always ask the question, well, what have you read lately? And sometimes they would say, well, do you mean like a computer book or a novel? Or I said, it doesn't matter. Just tell me what you've read. And 95% of the job candidates had not read anything in the last year. And I'm thinking, okay, they're in software. How in the world can they not read and keep up? You got to be a reader. You got to be a researcher, or or watching video. You got to be doing something to increase your knowledge. And it doesn't have to be specifically in that field, but you got to be doing it. I don't know how you progress, but it's always a good question to ask. It could be a subcontractor, somebody that's working with you, a freelancer, or an employee. Ask them, what have you read lately? It'll tell you a lot about that person.
And for the people who are listening to this and haven't read anything in the last year, any advice to those people?
Well, at least be watching YouTube videos. Come on.
Yeah.
I use the term read liberally, I suppose, because we're now in a digital media age. And so there's a lot, be listening to a podcast, be watching YouTube and Vimeo videos, subscribe to education packages like what you can get on Pencil King or lynda.com or something like that. That impresses me when I hear people doing that. But when I see people just doodling in social media aimlessly, I think that's kind of sad. I'm not against social media, don't get me wrong, but but it is sad to me if that's all they do is doodle in social media and are not accomplishing anything.
All right, this has been a great podcast, and I feel like just the sound of your voice, I could listen to you talk, and I need to listen to more of your podcasts over at Digital Convergence. Where can we find some of your stuff, Carl? Can you just shout out some URLs where we can direct people to, and then we'll wrap it up here.
Yeah, I will give you one URL that you can go to. It's called creativemethod.tv. That's the home of my podcast. You can see some of my work there. And it has my social media contacts. Hypocrite that I am, because I'm telling you about that. But you can connect with me there. So creativemethod.tv.
Perfect. And we'll have notes for this at pencilkings.com/podcast, where we always have it. I'm going to give another shout out for Mila Film. So if you haven't seen it yet, just go to milafilm.com and check those guys out, because I'm trying to help them promote. And I think it's a project that deserves some light shed onto it. So thank you so much, Carl. I really appreciate it. And if you're looking for more podcasts to listen to, Digital Convergence, it's out there waiting with 6 years of back episodes. So it should keep you busy for a while.
Yeah, at the time of recording this, I think it's 188 episodes. But I got to say, Mitch, I really appreciate you having me on your show. Now I know what my interview victims feel like. But you're doing a great job with what you're doing there, and I'd like to get you on my podcast at some point in the near future too.
Thanks so much, Carl. I really appreciate it.
Demands patience, skill, years of practice.
You talk like a fool. I would trade a century of practice for an ounce of inspiration.